Faceless Ones. The fluorescent lights in the hospital hallway flickered ominously as Emily made her way toward the intensive care unit. The harsh glare cast long shadows that seemed to shift and writhe along the stark white walls, creating a sense of unease that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. As the head nurse on the night shift, Emily was no stranger to the unsettling atmosphere that often permeated the hospital after dark. There was an undeniable heaviness to the air, a palpable tension that hung in the ether, amplified by the eerie silence broken only by the steady beeping of machines and the occasional muffled cry of a patient. But tonight, something felt different. A deep, primal part of her brain sensed danger, a primal warning that had been honed over millennia of human evolution. Her heart raced as she quickened her pace, the soles of her shoes squeaking against the freshly waxed linoleum. As she approached the ICU, the large double doors loomed before her, like the jaws of some unholy beast, the bright red, authorized personnel-only sign pulsing with an unnatural glow. With a trembling hand, she pushed the door open and stepped inside, the electronic lock clicking shut behind her. The ICU was a scene of controlled chaos. Nurses bustled about, checking vitals, administering medications, their faces tense with concentration. The air was thick with the hum of machinery and the occasional shrill alarm, the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors providing a strange, unsettling cadence. Emily scanned the room, her gaze settling on a lone figure hunched over a hospital bed in the far corner. As she drew closer, she recognized the pale, drawn features of Dr. Mallory, the head of the ICU. He was staring intently at the patient, his brow furrowed in a mix of concern and confusion. "Dr. Mallory," Emily called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" The doctor looked up, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and exhaustion. "Emily, thank God you're here. I need your help." Emily's heart sank. "What is it? What's wrong?" Dr. Mallory glanced back at the patient, his expression grim. It's Samantha. She's not responding to any of the treatments, and her condition is only getting worse." Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she approached the bedside, her gaze falling upon the still form of Samantha, one of her most trusted nurses. The young woman's face was ashen, her features slack and lifeless, save for the faint rise and fall of her chest. "What happened?" Emily asked, her voice hushed. "We're not sure," Dr. Mallory replied, his hands trembling slightly. "She came in yesterday complaining of severe headaches and nausea. We ran all the tests, but everything came back normal. Then last night she just collapsed." He paused, swallowing hard. "Emily, I've never seen anything like this before. Her vital signs are stable, but she's completely unresponsive. It's as if her mind has just shut down." Emily felt a chill wash over her as she stared down at Samantha's lifeless form. Something was terribly wrong. She could feel it in her bones. With a deep breath, she reached out and gently grasped the young woman's hand, willing her to wake up. "Samantha, can you hear me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's me, Emily. Please, open your eyes." But Samantha remained motionless, her eyes closed, her expression eerily serene. Emily felt a knot of dread forming in the pit of her stomach as she turned to Dr. Mallory, her mind racing. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Mallory shook his head, his face a mask of helplessness. "I don't know, Emily. I don't know." The hours ticked by in a blur of activity as the medical team worked tirelessly to find a solution, running test after test, trying every possible treatment. But nothing seemed to make any difference. Samantha's condition remained unchanged, her vital signs stable, but her mind seemingly trapped in a dark, impenetrable void. As the night wore on, Emily found herself growing increasingly exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The eerie, oppressive atmosphere of the ICU seemed to seep into her very bones, weighing her down with a sense of dread and despair. At one point, she found herself standing at the nurse's station, staring blankly at the computer screen, her mind clouded with fatigue and uncertainty. That was when she noticed it. A flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye. Whipping her head around, she scanned the room, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, but then she saw it again, a shadow darting across the far wall, just out of sight. Steeling her nerves, Emily cautiously made her way toward the source of the disturbance, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. As she drew closer, she could feel the hair on the back of her neck standing on end, a sense of unease washing over her. Rounding the corner, she found herself face to face with a darkened alcove, the pale glow of the emergency exit sign casting an eerie, otherworldly light over the space. Swallowing hard, she peered into the shadows, her eyes straining to make out any sign of movement. At first, she saw nothing, the darkness seemingly impenetrable. But then, suddenly, a flash of movement caught her eye, a dark, shapeless form that seemed to shift and writhe as if it were alive. Emily froze. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched the strange entity move, its movements fluid and unsettling, almost as if it were aware of her presence. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that she was not alone. Summoning her courage, she took a step forward, her gaze fixed on the shifting shadows. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" There was a long, tense moment of silence, and then suddenly the entity surged forward, its shapeless form coalescing into a horrific, humanoid shape. Emily let out a strangled scream as she stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature seemed to loom over her, its features indistinct and shifting, as if it were made of smoke and shadow. But what struck her most was the utter lack of a face. A smooth, featureless expanse where a face should be, a void that seemed to suck the light from the room. Emily felt a wave of pure terror wash over her, her mind reeling as she stared into the faceless void. Something about the creature's presence was profoundly unsettling, a primal fear that seemed to tap into the deepest, darkest corners of her psyche. Without thinking, she turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty hallway as she fled from the horrific entity. She could feel its presence, like a cold, clammy hand on the back of her neck, driving her onward with a sense of pure, unadulterated dread. As she rounded the corner, she found herself face to face with Dr. Mallory, his eyes wide with alarm. "Emily, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. How could she even begin to describe what she had just seen? It was impossible, unreal, a creature that seemed to defy all logic and reason. She stammered, her voice trembling. There's something in the alcove. Something terrible." Dr. Mallory's brow furrowed with confusion. "What are you talking about? What did you see?" Emily swallowed hard, her mind racing. I'm not sure. It was some kind of creature, but it didn't have a face. It was just a void." The doctor's expression darkened, a look of pure dread washing over his features. "A creature without a face," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes, and it was watching me. I could feel its presence, like it was aware of me." Dr. Mallory's face went pale. and for a moment he seemed to be at a loss for words. Then suddenly he grabbed Emily's arm, his grip tight and urgent. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice low and tense. "Now." Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she followed the doctor back toward the ICU, her mind reeling. What was happening? What was this thing that had appeared to her in the shadows? As they burst through the ICU doors, Emily couldn't help but glance back over her shoulder, half expecting to see the faceless entity lurking in the hallway. But the corridor was empty, save for the flickering lights and the eerie silence. Dr. Mallory herded Emily toward the nurses' station, his face a mask of grim determination. "Lock the doors," he instructed, his voice terse, "and call for backup. We need to get everyone out of here. Now." Emily's heart raced as she quickly complied, her fingers fumbling with the lock mechanism. As she reached for the phone, she couldn't help but glance back at Samantha's still form, a pang of worry cutting through the haze of fear and confusion. "What about Samantha?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Mallory's expression darkened, his eyes filled with a profound sense of sadness. "I'm sorry, Emily, but there's nothing more we can do for her." Emily felt her heart sink as she realized the implication of his words. Samantha was gone, and they were all in terrible, mortal danger. As the sound of the lock clicking into place reverberated through the ICU, Emily felt a sense of dread wash over her. Whatever was out there, whatever that thing was, it was coming for them. And in that moment, she knew that none of them were safe. The minutes ticked by in agonizing silence as Emily and Dr. Mallory waited, their eyes fixed on the ICU doors, their bodies tense with anticipation. The eerie quiet was broken only by the steady beeping of the machines and the occasional muffled sound from the other parts of the hospital. Emily's mind raced, her thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. What was this thing that had appeared to her in the shadows? And what did it want? She shuddered at the memory of its faceless, shifting form, the sheer wrongness of its very existence sending a chill down her spine. Suddenly, a loud bang resounded through the ICU, causing both Emily and Dr. Mallory to jump in alarm. They whirled around, their hearts pounding, only to see one of the nurses, a young man named Michael, pounding on the locked doors, his face a mask of terror. "Let me in! Let me in!" he screamed, his voice shrill and panicked. Emily felt her stomach twist with dread as she recognized the look of pure, unadulterated fear in Michael's eyes. Something was out there, something terrible, and it was coming for them. Without a moment's hesitation, Dr. Mallory rushed to the door, his hand trembling as he fumbled with the lock. As soon as the door swung open, Michael came barreling in, his clothes dishevelled and his eyes wild. It's out there," he gasped, his chest heaving. I couldn't get away." Dr. Mallory quickly slammed the door shut, locking it securely behind them. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice tense. Michael shook his head, his face pale as a ghost. I was in the break room and I saw it was just standing there in the hallway, and then it turned towards me." He shuddered, his entire body trembling. "It didn't have a face, Doctor. It didn't have a face." Emily felt her blood run cold as she listened to Michael's words, her mind reeling with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Could it be the same thing that she had seen in the alcove? "What did you do?" Dr. Mallory asked, his voice low and urgent. I ran," Michael admitted, his voice quaking. "I ran as fast as I could, but it chased me. I could feel it, Doctor. I could feel it watching me, following me." He paused, his face twisted with anguish. I couldn't outrun it. It was too fast. Emily felt her heart sink as she realized the implication of Michael's words. If this thing had been able to catch up to him, then what chance did they have? We need to get everyone out of here, Dr. Mallory said, his voice tense. Now. Emily nodded, her mind racing as she darted over to the nurse's station, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she began to issue a series of urgent alerts. Code Black. All personnel, evacuate the ICU immediately. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. As the alarm blared through the speakers, Emily felt a sense of dread wash over her. This is it, she thought, her heart pounding in her chest. We're running out of time. The next several minutes were a blur of frantic activity as the nurses and doctors scrambled to evacuate the ICU, their faces etched with a mix of fear and determination. Emily watched with a sinking heart as they wheeled the patients out, their fragile lives hanging in the balance. But as the last of the patients were ushered out, Emily couldn't help but glance back at Samantha's still form, her mind filled with a sense of anguish and guilt. I'm so sorry, she thought, her eyes burning with unshed tears. I couldn't save you. Emily, we need to go, Dr. Mallory said, his voice laced with urgency. It's not safe here. Emily nodded, swallowing hard as she tore her gaze away from Samantha's lifeless body. As she followed the doctor out of the ICU, she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread and uncertainty. What if this isn't the end? The hospital was in a state of chaos as the evacuation order was carried out, the air thick with the sound of running footsteps and the frantic voices of the staff. Emily followed Dr. Mallory down the winding corridors, her mind racing with a million questions. Where are we going? She asked, her voice trembling. The emergency exit, the doctor replied, his face etched with determination. We need to get out of the building, now. As they rounded the corner, Emily felt her heart skip a beat. There, standing in the middle of the hallway, was the thing, the faceless entity that had haunted the shadows of the ICU. Its form seemed to shift and writhe, as if it were made of smoke and shadow, and Emily could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Stop! The doctor yelled, his voice laced with fear and authority. Stay back! But the creature paid no heed, its formless body surging forward with terrifying speed. Emily felt a scream catch in her throat as she watched it lunge towards them, its featureless face a void of pure, unadulterated wrongness. Instinctively, she and Dr. Mallory turned and ran, their feet pounding against the linoleum as they desperately fled from the encroaching darkness. Emily could feel the creature's presence behind them, like a cold, clammy hand on the back of her neck, pushing her onward with a sense of pure, primal terror. As they rounded the corner, Emily's heart sank as she realized that they had reached a dead end, the emergency exit just out of reach. We're trapped, she thought, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and resignation. Whirling around, she watched in horror as the creature slowly approached them, its shapeless form coalescing into a vaguely humanoid shape. She could feel the weight of its gaze, a sense of awareness that sent a chill down her spine. Beside her, Dr. Mallory stood his ground, his face a mask of grim determination. Stay back, he yelled, his voice quaking. I won't let you hurt anyone else. But the creature paid him no heed, its formless body surging forward with a sudden, terrifying burst of speed. Emily watched in helpless horror as it engulfed the doctor, his screams echoing through the empty corridor. She stood frozen, her mind reeling with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Emily watched in utter horror as the faceless creature engulfed Dr. Mallory, his anguished screams piercing the air. For a moment she was paralyzed, her mind unable to process the sheer wrongness of what she was witnessing. But then, as the creature turned its attention towards her, she snapped out of her trance, every survival instinct kicking into overdrive. Without a moment's hesitation, she turned and fled, her heart pounding in her chest as she raced down the empty corridor. The faceless entity pursued her relentlessly, its shapeless form surging forward with preternatural speed. Emily could feel its presence behind her, a cold, suffocating weight that seemed to sap the very life from the air around her. As she rounded a corner, she caught a glimpse of the emergency exit, the bright red sign pulsing with an otherworldly glow. Just a little further, she thought, her lungs burning with the strain of her desperate sprint. But then suddenly, the creature was upon her, its formless body blocking her path. Emily skidded to a halt, her heart threatening to leap out of her chest as she stared into the faceless void, a scream catching in her throat. The creature seemed to loom over her, its very presence a tangible thing, a physical weight that pressed down upon her, robbing her of breath. She could feel its eyes, if it even had eyes, boring into her, a profound, unsettling awareness that sent shivers down her spine. Desperately, she cast her gaze about, searching for any means of escape. But the hallway was a dead end, the emergency exit tantalizingly out of reach. She was trapped at the mercy of this thing. Suddenly, the creature surged forward, its formless body engulfing her. Emily let out a strangled scream as she felt its icy tendrils wrap around her, enveloping her in a suffocating embrace. The world around her seemed to shift, the harsh fluorescent lights giving way to a strange, otherworldly glow. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down upon her, making it difficult to breathe. And then she saw it a face, emerging from the darkness. At first, it was just a vague, indistinct shape, like a smudge of charcoal on a canvas. But as it drew closer, it began to take form, features coalescing into something that was both achingly familiar and utterly, profoundly wrong. Emily felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she recognized the face. It was Samantha's, her former colleague, her friend. But the expression was wrong, distorted and twisted, as if the very essence of the woman had been corrupted. The creature's grip tightened, and Emily felt a sharp, burning pain, not physical, but a deep, visceral agony that seemed to pierce her very soul. She let out a strangled gasp, her vision blurring as the creature's tendrils snaked around her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. And then, suddenly, she saw it, the true face of the creature, the horrific truth that had been hidden behind the shifting, faceless form. It was a sight that would be seared into her memory for the rest of her days, a vision of pure, unadulterated evil. The creature's face was a vast, gaping maw, a ravenous, hungry orifice that seemed to suck the very life from the air around it. Rows of razor-sharp teeth, like daggers, lined its edges, dripping with a viscous, corrosive fluid. And within the depths of that terrible, endless void, Emily saw eyes, not the eyes of a human, but something else, something alien and profoundly unsettling. They were orbs of pure darkness, bottomless pits that seemed to bore into her very soul, stripping away her sanity, her very identity. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The creature's grip tightened, and she felt a terrible, searing agony as its corrosive fluids burned into her flesh, devouring her from the inside out. And as the darkness closed in around her, as the creature's unholy embrace consumed her, Emily knew, with a terrible, absolute certainty, that this was no mere nightmare. This was real, a reality that she could never, ever unsee. The hours ticked by in a blur, the hospital staff working tirelessly to secure the building and account for all the patients and personnel. But as the sun began to rise, casting an eerie golden glow over the scene, it became painfully clear that something had gone horribly wrong. Emily was nowhere to be found, and neither was Dr. Mallory. The bodies of the few unfortunate souls who had encountered the creature had been discovered, their faces frozen in expressions of pure, unadulterated terror. The authorities were called, and a massive search and rescue operation was launched. But as the hours turned into days, the grim reality began to set in. Emily and Dr. Mallory were gone, vanished without a trace. The hospital was sealed off, the entire area cordoned off as a crime scene. Teams of investigators scoured the building, searching for any clue, any shred of evidence that might shed light on the horrific events that had unfolded. But as they delved deeper into the mystery, they found themselves confronted with a truth that was almost too terrible to comprehend. The creature, the faceless entity that had claimed its victims, was not of this world. Whispers of a dark, ancient evil that had somehow breached the boundaries of our reality began to circulate, fueled by the growing sense of dread and unease that permeated the very air. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the truth became increasingly inescapable. The Faceless Ones had come, and they had not come in peace. The hospital, once a place of healing and hope, had become a nexus of unspeakable horror, a gateway to a world that defied all logic and reason. And the Faceless Ones, with their insatiable hunger and their unquenchable thirst for knowledge, would not be content to remain confined within its walls. Emily's fate, and the fate of all those who had fallen victim to the creature, remained a mystery, a dark stain on the collective consciousness of the community. But as the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, one undeniable truth became clear. The Faceless Ones were out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike again. And for those who had witnessed their terrible power, the haunting memory of their faceless visage would never truly fade, a terrifying reminder that some evils can never be unseen.